Thank you, Miss Robot Lady. This is the Noise Brigade. We are back. It is Bobby. It is Tom. And today we're going to talk about Sega.
Sega.
Sega!
Yeah, no. So we were kind of, I guess, thinking about some things to talk about, and really both of us were kind of blanking and didn't really have anything. And we've went down the video game road before, and you wanted to go Dreamcast, and I was like, dude, I'll give you like 30 seconds. um, so then I was like, well, let's expound on that. Let's not go so detailed. Let's do just Sega in general. And I think Sega was such a big part of our growing up that we can do a good episode on this.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, it's funny because, my first system was an Atari 2600. And then I went on to the NES. But after that, I got I had a Game Boy, and then I got a Genesis with Sonic the Hedgehog, of course, and Mike Ditka
Yes.
Power Football, which, good God, that game was terrible, but I loved it.
Yeah, and that's the funny. It's so funny you say that. And as we get to talking about this different Sega's consoles and games, obviously the first thing that really popped in my head was the Genesis 2. And you really think about how many powerful titles that system had. I mean, it really makes it close to ranking up to be an all-time great system. I mean, really puts it up top. I'm not going to say the best, but oof, just a litany of good titles on it.
Yeah, and that's the thing. Like, it was, you're kind of back when we were in school. There were the rich kids that had both, or well, the rich kids had TurboGrafx 16 or a Neo Geo, but us plebeians who could only have one 16-bit console, it was either Sega or it was Nintendo. And obviously the Super Nintendo has a fond place in my heart now, but I didn't have one growing up. Like, I would get to play it if I went over a friend's house. If I went to Richie's house, Richie had a Super Nintendo, and like sometimes he and I we'd let each other borrow consoles. But I grew up mostly when in the 16-bit era playing mostly Sega Genesis games.
Yeah, no, I I remember my first really foray into a console for Sega was obviously the Genesis. Um, and really what you said too, Sonic the Hedgehog. I mean, that's really was kind of your, gateway into the Sega world with people our age anyway.
Right.
You had always kind of heard about like the Sega Master and some other things, and it had come up before, and I wanted to bring this up before we got too heavy in the Genesis or console world, but uh, you're of course familiar with a lot of the Sega arcade games back in the 80s into the 90s, right?
Yeah, man. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
So I remember distinctly. I was little, very young, but I remember probably the first Sega game I remember playing was Afterburner.
Yep.
And I remember playing that at the arcade that was at the McGuire Fort Dix BXPX, kind of in their mall area.
Dude, I think that machine's still there.
It's possible, dude. That was there in like I think that game came out in '87.
Yeah, it's like
So it was probably it's probably been there since then.
oh, absolutely, absolutely.
um, and so that was really my first foray into Sega because I recall just being enthralled. Especially I mean you got to think too, it's like right after Top Gun had come out, and of course everyone's into fighter jets, especially you know kids our age.
Yeah.
So yeah, Afterburner was it, and I'd be remiss if I didn't mention this. What I'm about to say is not a Sega game, so I'm sorry. I'm taking a little bit of a segue here, but I don't know any other time that this is going to come up. But also at the McGuire Fort Dix BXPX arcade, Stun Runner, the Atari racing game.
Stunt Runner.
Stun Runner,
I don't
yeah,
remember.
STUN,
Oh,
and yeah,
I
Run
don't
Stun Runner.
remember that one.
Oh yeah, what a tremendous game. So yeah, again, not Sega, but I had that memory hit, and I had to mention it.
All right, all right.
Let's see, same vein though, in the same era with Sega, Super Hang On.
Yes, which everybody remembers that.
Yeah. So I don't know if you had any arcade memories of Sega like prior to us jumping into consoles, but those are the ones that really stuck with me, particularly
Yeah.
Afterburner.
Yeah, so I remember it's funny you say Afterburner. I remember that being at the Woodbury Heights bowling alley. Um, I remember seeing it there. I remember seeing it at various different arcades, the Deptford Mall, um, all over the place. That was like a mainstay. That and Street Fighter 2 were just
Yes.
everybody had them. Um, and I remember, you know, as far as the arcade, I remember all different games. But the two that stick out to me when I think of Sega arcade games, um, one of them is a classic, and one of them is classically, I don't know if it's bad or I don't know how to describe it. And then there's a third one that I really liked. So the third one that I really liked was Bonanza Brothers, which I don't know if you ever played that.
No, I'm not familiar with that one. I don't even know if I ever even heard of it.
Bonanza Brothers, it ends up on every single Sega like game collection. I think it's even on the one on the Switch. Um, you're controlling these two brothers, the Bonanza Brothers, who are um, basically burglars, and you have to walk them through the levels without them getting caught. And you got to try and
Ah,
get as much loot as you can while you're going through. And I remember playing that at like a Showbiz Pizza in Virginia Beach. Um, I remember playing it for the first time there, and then eventually playing it and owning it on Genesis. Um, the other two, and one of which I played at that same arcade, is Michael Jackson's Moonwalker.
oh wow, I forgot all about that game.
And
Wow.
it was really cool. It was like an isometric view. If on I don't remember if it was all the levels or if it was just certain levels in the arcade, because I only played it like once or twice in the arcade. Um, I liked it at the time because it was before we knew Michael Jackson was Michael Jackson. Um, but it was a cool game. It had Michael Jackson's music in it. The only other game I can ever remember that was so based on music was Revolution X with Aerosmith in it,
Oh, right, right.
which was really cool in the arcades. But again, not a Sega game. The only other arcade game from Sega that like sticks out to me, besides obviously like Afterburner and stuff like that, is Golden Axe.
Yes.
And I don't remember
Yeah.
if it was Golden Axe 1 or 2, but we used to before we moved to Florida, we used to come to Florida all the time when I was a kid. And I don't remember what grade I was in, but we were staying at Orange Lake Country Club in Orlando, and they had an arcade, and somehow, some way, somebody rigged the Golden Axe game. It was the only game in the arcade where you didn't have to put coins into play. Just
Oh, nice. So
somebody,
they bypassed the coin slot.
yeah, somebody figured out a way and bypassed coin slot, and the entire time I was there, nobody fixed it. And
Nice.
so whenever I could, I was in the arcade playing Golden Axe because it was the free game. I remember playing, and what Sega might have made this one. Um, there was a Superman game where the first player was blue Superman and the second player was red Superman. And it was right around the time where the terrible movie came out where the bad guy was the nuclear man.
Oh yeah, that's Superman 4, wasn't it?
Yeah, I think it was Superman 4, but it was based on that movie. And there was a red Superman and a blue Superman. And I remember always getting my butt kicked. But I really liked that game because it was Superman. And, at that time, nobody had an arcade game based on Superman. Um, but yeah, Golden Axe 2 or Golden Axe 1 or 2, whichever one it was. So the Sega arcade games were pretty good. But
Yeah, no.
I
And I will say the Golden Axe thing, I have to jump on that real quick.
yeah,
I was one I was gonna mention, and I remember dumping a ton of quarters in the Golden Axe machines over the years, but I don't ever remember being any good at them. I don't know why.
because no one's good at Golden Axe.
Yeah, exactly.
No one's good at Golden Axe. Golden Axe is one of those games that they made specifically. It's like the Simpsons arcade game, man. Nobody was good at the Simpsons arcade game. It was a fun game, but it existed solely to eat quarters.
Yes, yes.
So, I mean, later games in that vein, like Streets of Rage and Streets of Rage 2, you could actually go pretty far in the game without dying. But no, The original Golden Axe, no, man, that was like, okay, this is gonna be a murder simulator. We're just gonna like murder your children over and over again and make them give us quarters to do it.
It's so good. Now, moving forward a little bit though with Sega arcade games, because I think Sega did have a nice drop into it, but moving into the '90s, there's two that really stuck with me. On top of Daytona USA
Mm-hmm.
and Virtual Cop. Um,
So I was never, I mean, I remember playing Virtua Cop, I remember playing Daytona. My favorite from that era was a game called Virtual On.
okay, yeah, yep. That I do remember that. Oh, that is a good one.
Yeah, that was my favorite of that era. I would kind of want to delve into the home consoles a little bit though, real quick. Because what was so your first introduction to Sega was the arcade game?
Yeah, well, playing the arcade games was my first introduction, but for actually first system that I owned, or at least my parents got for me, was the Genesis.
Okay.
And obviously, and I can't remember if it came with either the original Sonic or Sonic 2. It just my memory is like, real cloudy on that. I just remember being a Sonic game, and I had both of them.
Okay.
I want to say it was the original. Based on timing. But yeah, those games obviously, and you and I have talked about some of these before, so I'm sure we'll have like a lot of repeats here. But like we've talked about some of these sports games before, like Super Baseball 2020
Yes.
and the NBA Jam games,
Yes.
the Mutant League football and hockey games.
Oh, yes. Wonderful.
Those things. And the other ones too, and you've mentioned these before, were the Shining Force games.
Yes.
And we've talked about that to a point where those were the Genesis's versions of Final Fantasy to me. Having kind of gone through the years and played everything, those are very solid games. But there's one game I wanted to talk about on the Genesis that I don't think a lot of people talk about: Columns.
Okay. All
And
right.
I say that Columns then tends to show up on the greatest hits packs at times, and it was puzzle game. It was kind of like their Tetris, but it's one of those easy to play but difficult to master. And I remember sinking a lot of time into that one. Just because I love those type of games. You
Yeah.
know that I've mentioned that many times. Heck, I'm a few thousand points away from I'm level 99 in Tetris 99 right now.
Nice.
So I'm about to roll up to a star finally. That's
That's
how
awesome.
that's how much I play those games. So yeah, I got to give a lot of love to Columns. So how about you? Like, what are your Genesis like games memories? What do you have?
So I played the Master System before I even played the Genesis.
Okay,
I succinctly remember playing Tommy Lasorda baseball on
nice.
the Master System. But that was it. But what I really liked about the Genesis, the first game I think that I ever played on the Genesis was Sonic the Hedgehog 1. I remember playing it at a birthday party. Um, and it was mind-blowing to see, like, wait, this is at home? We're playing this at home? And so playing that, and then I remember borrowing games from friends and having there was a game which again, it's one of those ones that was kind of obscure, and I think it's worth a decent amount of money right now. It was called Herzog's Y, and it
Hmm.
was a real-time strategy game. So think Red Alert.
Yeah. Oh yeah. Okay.
So it was in that vein, but it was on the Genesis, and it was really good. It was really well done. I always got my butt kicked at it, but I still loved playing it. And but what was cool to me with the Genesis, and of course I'm learning this later in life, um, was I'd always heard of the power base converter and all these different, and obviously we will get to like the Sega CD and 32X and all that stuff. But the power base converter, if you don't know, was actually, you could plug it into the top of the Genesis and you could play all of the old games from the Master System. And what was cool about the Master System is not only did it have cartridges, but are you familiar with TurboGrafx 16 at all?
Yeah, I never had one, and I played it very sparingly. I had a friend that had one, but that was it. I never, you know, never had one, though. I don't have enough to speak on it.
So that's a system it's on my bucket list of systems to own. Um, and I've played it once or twice. Richie had one. Again, Richie, his mom ended up snagging it at like a flea market or something, and so he grabbed it and he was playing with it, and it was cool. But the cool thing to me was it used these things called hue cards, which it's just basically it's almost like the cards that we used to stick in the satellite dish receivers back in the day.
Hmm.
So the games came on that. Well, the Master System had a slot for cards like that, and it released a bunch of games on that, and it had like better graphics and better sound and stuff. Well, on the power base converter, you could plug them into it too.
Oh, huh.
And little do a lot of people realize, but most of the games that came out on Game Gear were actually just converted Master System games.
Yeah, I remember reading that at some point. It was years after I actually had a Game Gear. So that makes a lot of sense, actually.
And like Sonic, Sonic the Hedgehog didn't just come out on the Genesis, it came out on the Master System, but it was different. Like there were differences, like it had like an overworld map and stuff. Like
Huh.
there were some major differences, but it was cool that it was cool to me to learn that and this to see all that. But as far as I guess I kind of got off topic there. If we're gonna go, do you remember a game called Rocket Knight Adventure?
I never played it, but I'm aware of it.
Dude, so this game you played as a possum in a suit of armor with a giant sword and a jetpack. And it was just as bat as crazy as it sounds. And I remember playing it when I was little and beating it because I borrowed it from a kid down the street, Frankie Long. I borrowed it from him and I beat it and I gave it back to him. I'm like, man, that game was really cool. And it's always stuck with me. It was one of those games that I was like, man, that game was really cool. I wish they would have continued that series. So recently, I had gotten back into collecting retro stuff and I got that game.
Oh,
Uh,
no kidding.
and dude, I am god awful at it. I'm terrible. I remember playing it and thinking it was an easy game. And now I'm playing like I was playing it trying to show Peyton. I'm like, yo, check out this game. This game's really cool. And then I died like super quick. And he's like, yeah, yeah, cool. I like the way you die. Like, like it was embarrassing. But there were so many cool games for the Genesis and stuff that you couldn't like. What worked out well for me was it seemed like Genesis was more of a sports game console. It seemed like EA Sports put out their best version of everything
Yeah,
on
yeah.
that console. And then Sega Sports themselves were making outstanding games like the NFL games like Joe Montana football and NCAA football that they used to produce was great. World Series baseball, uh,
Yep.
you
Yeah, I
know,
was gonna say that the Madden games are legendary on the Genesis.
yeah.
Um, NHL. I mean, we don't have to get into that,
Oh God, yeah, I love the NHL games. Like so good. But and then what was cool too was, you know, there were games that came out on the Genesis for like there was a Mega Man game. Unfortunately, didn't get released in the States. It only got released in Europe and I believe like Brazil and I don't even know if it came out in Japan, but it was called Mega Man: The Wily Wars. Um, and it actually had Mega Man 1, 2, and 3 all on it.
hmm.
And I actually there's a company called Retrobit who does reproductions and limited print games and stuff, and they actually just made an American version and they patched all the bugs that were in the original and they re-released it on cartridge. I'm still waiting for mine to get to me, but I do have that on the way, so to give you a report on that
Yeah,
when it
nice.
finally gets in. Um, but there were just really cool, like if the Genesis didn't have the game like Legend of Zelda. Legend of Zelda is a great game. Never came out on the Switch or on the Switch, yeah, on the Genesis for obvious reasons. But there was a game called Legend of Senti, which came out, which it's not the same. You can't say it's better than Zelda, but it was pretty darn good in its own right. Unfortunately, I never got a copy of it, but and I never will, based on the fact that last time I looked at it on eBay, it was like $600.
Oh
Uh,
gosh.
yeah, but I mean the rarity and the price speak to the quality of the game. Like it's a good game. It's something I'm gonna have to play illegally through emulation, because I'm not spending $600 on a Genesis cartridge. But there were plenty of games that came out, to mirror some of Nintendo's stuff, and a lot of the stuff, even when it came out on multi-platform, the Genesis version was better. Like I know I've played, and maybe it's just my nostalgia speaking, but I doubt it. I've played the Genesis and the Super Nintendo version of Aladdin, and in the Super
Mhm.
Nintendo version, you don't have a sword. I think you throw apples, which that was like your secondary attack in the one for Genesis. The Genesis one was much better. Um, there was another one that I had right on top of my head, and I can't remember it now. Oh, Maximum Carnage. Did you ever play that
Oh
game?
yeah, yes, yes, I have. Yeah, I remember renting that game. Never had
So
it, but I remember renting it.
I bought it. I actually got it on the red cartridge, and
Nice.
I remember that it being so much better on the Genesis than on the Super Nintendo. And again, I mean that may be a situation again where it's nostalgia speaking. Um, and I grew up with the Genesis version, and I didn't play the Super Nintendo version until I was older. But it seemed so much better on the Genesis. Even now, if I go
Yeah,
back and play,
I think it's funny. I go back sometimes. I'm big on soundtrack and theme music, and if you go back and this is something that YouTube and take and find like some of the NBA Jam music, and I think it's a good kind of case study in how different it really can be. And you listen to it on like the Super Nintendo or the arcade version or the Genesis version or the Sega CD version. And obviously the Sega CD version kind of wins out because of
right?
quality. But comparatively, like the Genesis to the Super Nintendo, Genesis wins. Like just I'm just talking straight up music. I'm not talking about gameplay or any of that. I'm just talking about audio quality. And I don't know why that is. It just maybe, the way that things are programmed, whatever. But to me, it just sounds better. Um, but the funny thing is, I also think about like differences with games too, because like you said, the differences with Aladdin with Super Nintendo and Genesis. Have you ever played Home Alone 2 for both systems?
No, I've never played any of the Home Alone games.
Okay, they might as well be, to me anyway, entirely different games.
Really?
It was released for both, but I mean, the one for Super Nintendo is like an acid trip. It's insane. The game makes no sense. Kevin McAllister gets attacked by luggage. It is bizarre. Now, I'm not saying the same thing doesn't happen with the Genesis one, but it's a little bit more toned down from what I recall. It's not as out there.
Right.
But that to me, the funny thing was it's released at the same time. Obviously, it's a movie-based game. It's released with the movie because that's what happens. It still happens to this day. But they were just different games. Again, was it a matter of like the programmers behind it, the developers, like, hey, this is what we have in mind. This is what we have. It's just a different enough, just to me, it was like a different game.
Right.
So again, I can't say one is better than the other necessarily. I'm just saying that I think that was kind of cool. It's like you said, it didn't have exactly a Zelda game, but it had something that brought to the table. It didn't have the Final Fantasy games, but it had something that had brought to the table that's really, really good.
And
You
I'll tell you
know,
what, it for my money, I'll take Shining Force over Final Fantasy any day of the week.
I really enjoy those games. And I remember playing Shining Force. Oh, I can't remember the name of it. It was a Shining Force game for the Game Gear.
Oh,
I
Sword
sort
of
of Hija
I
or
something. Yeah.
yeah, I can't pronounce it. Excellent game. Um, Another just really, really good. They really hit home runs with all those. But again, I just don't. They're just not to me as well regarded because they're not Square Enix games,
Right.
basically.
Well, that what's funny that the Shining Force for Game Gear is actually on the 3DS.
Okay, yeah, wow, cool.
Yeah, you can download it on the eShop.
Oh, cool. Huh.
So, because that's when I missed when I was playing. When I had my Game Gear, that was one that I didn't get. I don't even think I knew it existed, but it was one that I was able to pick up later in life as a download on the eShop. So,
Nice. Huh. Now I had a Game Gear, but I don't recall having that many games for it. Um, but one thing does stick in my head was I had, and this was middle of the road baseball game, but I had the majors pro baseball, and I did an entire season. I do remember doing that.
okay,
162 games, did an entire season with it. Because that was, again, it was an era where you didn't really have too many baseball games that were doing that,
right,
especially on a handheld color.
right,
That was very unheard of. Was it a great game? No. But again, like you've mentioned many times, and I have too, fond memories,
right.
so that's one that always sticks with me. And
So,
Sonic, obviously, Game Gear. I mean, I can take Sonic. I have Sonic, and now I have it in my hands. Especially when you're a kid.
yeah.
Oh man, that doesn't get any better than that.
So I can remember I could probably rattle off every game I had for Game Gear right now. Um, I remember, and I remember two of them that God help me, I wish I never would have gotten rid of because they've reached, or at least one of them has reached that like $600 range. Um, and it's so I remember having uh, Sonic Triple, I think it was called Triple Trouble or something like that, and it focused more on Tails for some reason.
Hmm.
Um, but I had that. I had Road Rash,
Oh yes.
which,
Oh,
dude, Road Rash on the Game Gear. Like I thought, oh, I liked Road Rash on the Game Gear. I'm gonna like it on every other system. I have not liked a Road Rash game that I've played besides the one that was on Game Gear.
did they release that for the Saturn?
There was
Or
a there was a Road Rash for Saturn, yes.
okay, I don't mean to jump ahead here. I recall playing one that was a little more detailed.
Yeah. Yeah, I had that game.
Okay, so you know what I'm talking about. Okay,
Yeah.
so I didn't mean to interrupt. I just was
No,
trying
no,
to.
you're good. You just gave me PTSD from that one. Um, all right, so we had Sonic Triple Trouble, Road Rash, which was outstanding, Madden 95, um,
Nice.
one of the RBI baseball games, which I can't remember. Or maybe it was Madden 96. I don't know. It was one of the Madden games I had for Game Gear. Um, and then what was so Sonic Drift 2, which if you're not familiar, Sonic Drift 2 was kind of Sega's answer to Mario Kart without weapons. So
Yeah, vaguely recall that game. Never played it, but I remember seeing different things about it.
it was an odd one. I really enjoyed it, but it was one of those games that was just kind of like, okay, I really wanted it because I wanted Mario Kart, but with Sega characters, and then I got it and realized you couldn't like throw turtle shells at people, and I was kind of let down. Um, and I had a game called Air Force Delta, which was a side-scrolling shoot 'em up. Um, and then if I remember correctly, the only other game that I ever had for my Game Gear was Mega Man.
Mm.
And that Mega Man, it was kind of like the Game Boy games, like the Game Boy Mega Man games, where it was pared down as far as there was only so many characters per. But it was cool because there was robot bosses that weren't in any of the other games, and I remember that game, and I remember how hard it was. It was a difficult game. But what I'll always remember about it is two things. Number one, I remember exactly what I traded it in for at the then Funko Land, um, and I remember that I'm an idiot for getting rid of it. And so again, it's worth like 600 some dollars now. It's one of the most rare games that has ever been produced in the United States. I was a freshman in college, and at this point, I didn't have a Game Boy anymore because my Game Boy, um, so I had been grounded from playing video games during Christmas break, and I had gotten a C because I got a C on my report card. Um, and so it was 93, 94, somewhere in that area. And I just gotten Super Mario Land 2, the six golden coins. And I couldn't resist playing it. So I tried to sneak playing it in my room, and I pulled out a drawer from my dresser to hang over. And somebody came in my room, and I jumped because obviously I was sneaking playing a game that I shouldn't have been playing. And I knocked the dresser drawer out of the dresser, and it fell on the screen and broke the screen on the Game Boy.
No.
So yeah.
uh,
So
that's
that
that's a
ended,
good story.
yeah, so that ended my Game Boy experience. It lasted for a little bit longer after that, but it was like the contrast was constantly changing. So I would have to, during the game, I'd have to pause it and like smack the screen and make it try and, because I didn't know anything about taking it. I wasn't going to take it apart at that age.
Yeah, there was no YouTube back then.
There were, as far as I was concerned, there were little demons and whatever running around in there making things work. So I wasn't about to let them out in my house. Um, but yeah, so I traded my Game Gear and all of the games, including that Mega Man that I actually had the box and all of the inserts and everything. Like it was complete in box. Traded it in at Funko Land for a Game Boy Pocket, and it was a red Game Boy Pocket and Pokemon Blue
Oh wow.
and Blades of Steel.
Yeah, and it's a shame because I think I still have a Funko Land Nintendo cartridge
Oh yeah,
case somewhere in my. I've got to find. If I find it, we'll throw a picture out on Twitter under this
yeah.
account.
That's
Um,
funny.
yeah. But if for those of you who are unaware of what Funko Land was like the original video game reseller. You could go bring in your old games. They'd give you credit for it or cash. And I remember they used to have the newspaper
Yes,
every like I don't know how often it released. It was like
it
once
was
a
like
month or
yeah, it
something
was
like
once
that.
a month they would release this newspaper, and you could take it, and it would give you the prices of what they were going to pay
Yeah,
because
and
it
they'd even
wasn't
have
such a
like
volatile market then.
and they had like cash price and they had credit price.
Did I don't remember them doing cash.
I could
I
have
mean, maybe
sworn
because I
they.
was a little kid and I only just gave a crap
Yeah,
about the credit.
and maybe I'm wrong. Maybe I'm wrong, but I'm just this. I vaguely recall of saying like, and maybe it was one of those things that changed over time. But I remember saying like, "Hey, we'll give you $7 cash or $10 credit, store credit."
Right, right.
I just remember being different. I could be completely wrong, but I do remember going there several times over, and yeah, kicking myself. Not that I had anything that I don't have the memory like you on that. Like I don't know exactly what I had or didn't have. I knew some things. Um, I just, a lot of the ones that I would probably have that are worth a lot more or anything that would be as I got a little older, like more Super Nintendo stuff that I acquired and then I dumped over.
Right, right.
So that would probably be it. But yeah, nothing Sega wise. I do want to say something though. Did you ever play the Virtual Fighter game for PC?
No.
Okay, so I wanted to talk about this briefly because my I remember my parents got like they would be always big on home PCs. In fact, their first computer in the house was like before I was born. And for reference, guys, I'm almost 40. So yeah, so I grew up with it like literally, and in an era where like not a lot of people did. And I recall though, I was probably 12 or 13 years old, and dad had just gotten new desktop PC and it ran Windows 95 and it was like the coolest thing in the world, at the time. And so, oh, look at this, really neat. And it came with a free game. And I was like, oh, and it was Virtua Fighter Remix.
Okay.
And it was a PC, PC version. a Virtual Fighter.
Nice.
And I thought it was the coolest thing in the world. It was like, there's an arcade game that I can play on the computer. What is this? But it was like, the Virtual Fighter graphics. It wasn't like the traditional, you know, two dimension two dimensional scrollers that I've been playing,
Right.
or any of those other things. This was like legitimate, like that era arcade game at home. So yeah, I just remember it came with a computer, and God knows what that cost back then.
Oh,
You
seriously.
know, yeah, here's a $4,000 PC, which was like God knows what $6,000 or $7,000 or more at that time. And here's your free Virtual Fighter.
Now, the only, besides the arcades, the only real experience I had with Virtua Fighter was on the 32X.
Okay.
So the
You had one, right?
oh yeah, dude. Yeah, so I was a savvy little, I don't know, 16, 17-year old or whatever the hell I was when this happened. Um, but I used to read IGM and Game Pro and all that crap like everybody else did. And I remember seeing the 32X and really wanting one. But then thinking about it and like, you know what? No, I don't really need one until we were at Walmart one day. We were at the Walmart in Cross Keys, and they had it marked down to like $20 before Christmas because it was after they basically discontinued it.
Mm.
Um, and I was like, "Hey, mom," I was like, "Can I have that like as a Christmas present?" And she was like, "Oh, how much is it?" It's $20. She said, "Yeah, okay." So she let me get that and a game. And so I, in my stupidity, instead of picking something good like Knuckles Chaotix or like the Spider-Man game that came out for it, both of which are worth a ton of money now, by the way. Um, I picked this game called Metalhead because Metalhead was like basically having Mech Warrior on your 32X, except for super crappy and slow as hell. Um, did you have any? And then but I did end up. I played a slew of games on it. I remember playing Virtua Racing on it. I played Virtua Fighter, and I remember playing. What was the other game? There was a couple because in college I actually snagged a couple in a clearance bin at Electronics Boutique at the Hamilton Mall. I remember getting Primal Rage, which Primal Rage was broken. There was a bad uh, something was bad in it, and so the characters didn't show up on the screen. Um, and then I got the Star Wars arcade game for it,
Mm.
and this game called Cosmic Carnage, which was terrible. It was a fighting game, and it was just god awful. Um, and I want to say I had Doom, but Doom was terrible for it too.
Really?
Yeah.
That was
Well,
funny how you could screw up Doom. But I
well,
guess back then it's possible on a console.
it didn't run fast. Like it was really, I guess they had to rush it out.
Mm.
It was like super super rushed, and so the animation was terrible. um like the frames per second were like, I want to say, if it wasn't like 10 or 15, it was like 9. It couldn't fill up the whole screen, and they butchered the music.
Mm.
So overall, it was just a bad game.
Yeah.
Um,
And Doom, if you butcher the music, yeah, that's yeah,
yeah.
no, no.
So, but the 32X, I thought it was a really good idea. Or you know, looking back, I think it was a good idea. They just didn't commit to it enough. And as I've learned, with both the Sega CD and the 32X, Sega Japan just didn't want anything to do with the 32X. Sega of Japan was just saying no, we're not gonna do that. That was Sega. The 32X was a Sega of America idea.
Yeah, and sometimes they fall flat, and
Yeah.
uh, we'll have to touch on the other add-on for the Genesis, the Sega CD. I see. That's why I didn't have a 32X. I never had a Sega CD, but I do recall, you know, people that had them,
Mm-hmm.
playing certain games, and Sega CD. Yeah, everyone, Night Trap was one that always comes to mind because people always bring that one up because that was like the first big, like really controversial, for that era.
Yeah, yeah. They actually
Um,
they just released it for the Switch.
did they really?
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah, not too long ago it got released for the
Talk
Switch.
talk about a change in times, I guess.
Right?
Um,
Nintendo wouldn't allow blood in Mortal Kombat, and now
now that yeah,
we've got
now
Night
they've
Trap.
released Night Trap, which but what was and I wanted to look this up before I mentioned it, but I couldn't. What was the Wild West
Mad
game?
Dog
The
McCree.
That's it, Mad Dog McCree. Okay, that one I do recall. That was an arcade game, wasn't it?
It was. It was one of those weird laser disc games.
Yes. Okay. 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 Yeah. Yeah. All right. So now, did you have one or play much of anything Sega
So
CD wise?
I wanted a Sega CD. It's because I had a Sega. I wanted a Sega CD. I never got it. I had a couple friends who had it. I never really played anything on it, but I do remember some of the games very, very well. Um, one of which being Sonic CD, which I've played since. Ryan actually got it. My brother Ryan got it for the computer at one point. Um, and I remember being on there, and I remember I've played it in different collections. I'm pretty sure that I have it on either Xbox or PlayStation or something in one of the collections. But game's cool. It's a Sonic game. It had a cool time travel element. So you could go into the past or you could go into the future, and or you could stay in the present. It was really cool. I liked it. It's a Sonic game. It was a good one. Um, but there were some other games that came out for it. Not so good games. CNC Music Factory.
Oh
Does that one
God.
ring a bell?
The band, like the
Yeah, yeah,
group,
yeah.
there was a game.
There was a game where you made the music video,
Oh my.
and there was another one starring Marky Mark Wahlberg,
Oh wow. Oh wow.
and you had to.
The Funky Bunch.
I believe the Funky Bunch were involved, and I'm not talking about his nutsack.
Oh boy. Oh
Uh,
my.
yeah. So it's yeah, you got to make the music video, um, and I never played them. I just remember seeing that being a game, and I'm like, and even as a kid, just being like, really? This is what we're doing with this thing? We're not making like super cool games. We're making Marky Mark.
Yeah. And
So
I like I said, that was one of those things I think I really wanted for a minute. I really, and by the time I got around to wanting it, because here's the thing, I was also a big PC gamer at
mhm.
the time, and I was already getting really familiar with, CD-ROMs. I already had all that stuff on PC. So like maybe the games were different, but it wasn't anything that like really struck out to me as like, oh, I need to get that because it's like I've been messing with CDs for a while already at that point.
Right.
And I had been. So it wasn't like anything that was revolutionary to me, I guess. But I do remember, obviously the Night Trap stuff and like you mentioned the Magnog McCree. I just couldn't remember the name. But the one thing, and I've already mentioned it on here, is talking about the music. Like I said, the team select or any of those music things they have for NBA Jam, just go back and listen to that on there's different versions on YouTube. And it's just so cool to like hear the differences. Sega CD obviously is so crisp and so clear,
Right.
and for rightfully so. So all right, let's move on to maybe a little more the last two systems they had, and one of these I actually had, and I held on to it, and then I sold it to you.
Yes. Yes, you did.
Sega Saturn.
Yes. Ah,
So yeah,
I
yeah.
wanted it to
You
be
didn't
good.
have? Did you have one
I
prior to me
no,
selling you mine?
I never had one, and that was part of the reason I wanted to buy yours, because I was like, you know what? I never had a Sega Saturn. I wanted one. I never had it. Now I can get one. So that was me like fulfilling childhood like wishes, was buying your Sega Saturn. I'd like to say I still have it, but sadly I don't. Uh,
It's all good because like I'd never appreciated it when I had it. I spent a lot of time playing like NBA Action,
Yes.
I had it in a really weird time where I was still into like these really cool sports games, obviously, but I didn't wasn't quite into like, games that really jumped off the charts. But I do remember two that really stuck with me. Again, I ended up getting Virtual Cop for it because I was such a big fan of it in the arcade. But Die Hard Arcade, um, that's another one that I really recall playing a ton of that I wish I still had. Big Die Hard fan. So, I kind of would like to have that one back.
Right.
But really, I didn't really recall playing anything that was like, you know, uh, the mind blowing games that people discuss with that system. I never really had them or played them because I didn't appreciate it. I'm over here playing like Sega Rally Championship.
Dude,
you know,
it's funny you say that. I think that hold on. I'm gonna look in this drawer real quick. There's a high possibility that that's actually sitting in this drawer, sitting next to me right now.
and that's yeah. I mean, dude, that was about it though. Like, I just don't really recall playing anything of what people would consider now substance. Outside of Die Hard Arcade, I think that's pretty
I think I might have,
substantive.
I think I might have thrown it out because it was really scratched up. It still played, but I couldn't do anything with it. I don't have a Saturn anymore. Um, I can't believe I actually brought myself to throw out a game though. But no, so all right, here's the deal with me, and sorry, I'm still looking because I need to know. All right, all right. But so when I bought that from you, I was working part-time at a game store. Um, if I knew the quality of some of the games, if I was into the same stuff now that I was into then, or vice versa, if I was into the same stuff then that I'm into now, as far as like RPGs and stuff like that, dude, I'd be sitting on a gold mine because back then the games weren't as expensive, obviously, as they are now. Um, there's a game called Albert Odyssey where you play as young Albert Einstein in some kind of fantasy world, and it's like this super awesome RPG, super quirky, but impossible to find now, and it costs like $300 if you do find it. Um, and like that seems to be that's the problem with the Saturn now, and that's why I don't have one anymore because now like I played some really cool games in there. Sonic 3D Blast gets a lot of shit from a lot of people. I thought it was really cool. It was a little bit more difficult. It wasn't a typical Sonic game, but it was fun for what it was.
Right.
Obviously Virtua Cop, I played it on that too. Virtua Fighter, played it on there. NBA Jam, I had NBA Jam Tournament Edition on there because
Nice.
you have to. I had Road Rage, which, oh God, or Road Rash rather, which I hated because it tainted my memories of my copy for the
Yeah,
Game Gear.
that's the one. Yeah, that's the one I had been thinking of earlier. Yeah, that was an interesting version of that game.
I didn't like it at all. I'm trying. I had some other games for it that were, I had this game that I remember very fondly from reading about in the articles in the magazines and stuff when we were younger, called Mr. Bones, where you're like a skeleton that gets brought back to life, and all these skeletons are evil, and you're like the one good one, and you have to play a guitar and stuff. And I remember being so excited to get it, and I got it, and I put it in, and I played it for 5 minutes and turned it off and got rid of it because I don't know if it was because I was using a third party controller, and maybe that controller was janky, or what the deal was. I literally could not get past the first 30 seconds of the game. And I remember everybody talking about, oh, the game's great, it's great, it's great. And even stuff I read now, oh, it's great, it's great. I was just watching a list of old games that people wish would get remade, and that was one of them. And I'm like,
You're
no,
like, no.
no, that game can go to hell. It can go to hell and die. Um, but there was a lot of great games for that system. The problem is because the system didn't sell well, there's not as many copies of it in the States, and will never, you can't play that legally and not be like a multimillionaire.
Yeah, yeah. That's
Even sorry to cut you off, but the one game that I specifically remember, it was the very first game I ever played for the Saturn, and I played it in, I believe, in Sears at the Deptford Mall. Was they had Nights into Dreams.
mm. I remember that was one of their big titles that got a lot of press. Um, you know, uh, that got a lot of like ad space, didn't it? If I
Yeah,
remember
it did.
correctly.
Yeah, it got a ton of ad space, and part of the reason was because it came with that, they called it the 3D controller, which was a precursor to their next systems controller, and it was one of the first systems that had an analog joystick.
Oh, that's right. Yeah, I forgot all about that.
Yeah, it was that round controller.
Yeah, that's right.
It came with the game, and it was so cool. And I remember thinking, like, man, this is so awesome. Now, I mean, if I remember correctly, the game wasn't all that good, but I just have that rosy nostalgia view of it being this amazing game. Um, and I just, it was just one of those games that I really wanted when I was a kid. That, and I think the other game that they had on there was that the WWF. Um, oh, what was that game? Was it In Your House? The one where it was like an arcade game, and you would, like, you'd hit Yokozuna and ham would fly out of him and stuff.
Oh yeah, there was WWF. It was a WrestleMania game.
Yeah,
Um,
yeah, yeah, yeah.
yeah, that
It was
was yeah. It was
WrestleMania, the arcade game.
yep. Yeah, I'd never played it, but that's what it was.
Yeah, I
Um,
remember playing that at that Sears, and I don't remember. Maybe it wasn't on. I know the game came out for 32X. Or I mean, for well, it came out on 32X too, but it was out on Saturn as well. Um, but maybe I was playing the PlayStation one at that time. Um, but but yeah, I remember playing that game. Um, and I mean, it's cool. The game, the system is really cool. If you can read Japanese, you can actually order the Japanese games, and most of them are cheaper. Um, but again, you have to, because most of them don't have like the language switch, but you can get one of those like a Game Shark or whatever, and plug it
mhm.
into that expansion slot on the back that I thought was for Genesis games at first. Silly me. Um, and it'll translate, or it'll allow you to play the games, like it breaks the region lock.
Oh, cool. Huh.
So
Interesting.
yeah. Which actually, if you didn't know, there was, obviously the Genesis, or with Sega, they released the CDX, which was the combination Genesis and Sega CD. It was a smaller footprint, and they released the Nomad, which was a portable Genesis, like
hmm
literally just a Genesis in your hands. It 8 batteries like nobody's business. But there was a time when they were thinking about putting out a combination Sega Saturn and Genesis at the same time, and it would have been able to play 32X games too. Like, it was going to be an all-in-one system, but they ended up canceling it due to how poorly the 32X was selling.
Yeah, that makes sense. And imagine the Saturn sales certainly
Yeah,
certainly pumped the brakes on a lot of other things too.
the whole reason. Well, part of the reason why the Saturn didn't do as well in the States was they were trying to counteract Sony and the PlayStation, and
Yeah,
they
yeah.
released. They were supposed to release, I think, in September or November that year, and at E3 they said, "Oh yeah, by the way, we're going to send out systems to stores tomorrow." So like KB Toys and stuff, they're thinking, "Oh, we still got some time to clear shelf space. We still have time to get pre-orders and to hype this system up." And developers are thinking, "Oh, we still got time to get games together and get them out." And then Sega just all of a sudden pulls a Charlie and goes wild card and says, "Oh no, we're releasing it tomorrow." Like, and that really stuck in a lot of people's craws. That really pissed off a lot of people, and that's part of the reason why you don't have a whole lot of support going forward. Square Enix and EA were not on the Dreamcast.
Yeah, yeah, and that's that. I think that's a good nice segue because that was end up being the last system was the Dreamcast, and funny enough, how this whole episode started was you said, "Hey, let's do it on the Dreamcast," and I was like, outside of the homebrew ROM stuff that you gave me, I don't have a whole lot to talk about.
So
That was just one of those systems where I had it and I had a few games for it, but yeah, no, the ROM stuff was about where the buck stopped with me on that.
so I've got quite a bit to say on the Dreamcast. I mean, I've had quite a bit to say this entire podcast. I feel like I've been railroading you a little bit, and which is obviously not intentional, but obviously the Sega is very near and dear to my heart. I still play a Sega game almost every day in NFL 2K5. Um, but the Dreamcast, I remember everything about this system coming out, the lifespan and the death. And I'm still learning new stuff because I'm so nerdy. Like I'll be laying in bed, I'm like, oh, let me go on YouTube, and then I start looking through stuff, and I go down the rabbit hole, and like I just learned there was actually a zip drive planned for it.
Really? Huh.
Yeah, to aid in the online functionality. It was gonna plug right in where the modem plugged in, and it had a broadband adapter, um, plugged right in, and it sat on the bottom, kind of like the 64 disk drive that got canceled in America, for the Nintendo 64, and it worked like that, and you could do all kinds of stuff with it. It was really cool, but they killed it because it was set to be announced the day after the Dreamcast was actually discontinued. So obviously they're not going to release that for a discontinued system. But the Dreamcast, man, I remember 9/9/99. It was Dreamcast Day. I remember the ad campaign. It's thinking all the different characters rendered as they were in game, sitting in a bar and talk. So like Sonic the Hedgehog's having a beer with Randy Moss, because Randy Moss was the cover
Oh
athlete for the first
yeah,
NFL 2K
yeah.
for the Dreamcast. Um, and one of the reasons, obviously, I just said for EA not being on the system was the whole the way they handled the release for the Saturn. Do you know the second reason?
Mm, I don't.
They didn't want Sega to produce their own sports games.
That makes sense.
They didn't want the 2K series in any sport. They didn't want World Series baseball. They didn't want it was NHL 2K, NBA 2K, and NFL 2K. They didn't want any competition from anybody. And since Sega said no, we're still going to make our sports games, EA said no. Well, then screw it. We're not making any games for your system.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Which is
I
funny though, because Sony was making theirs, and EA released on their system.
Yeah, that probably had to do with more of a projection thing, I would think.
Yeah,
They probably saw kind of the writing on the wall, knowing like, hey, this is where it's going. They saw PlayStation obviously at that point was, pulling some crazy numbers, and they kind of could look into the crystal ball, if you will. That's
yeah,
probably more what that was. They were looking at dollar signs and saying, look, hey, we know that this is going to sell this many systems, or we think this is going to. Probably not worth it for us to divest our energy and time into, developing software for it.
right. But you bring up a good point. I mean, I remember obviously I had a lot of good memories of playing. My freshman year of college was when that released, and one of the guys down the hall, his dad came down and took him to the mall, took his N64 and all of his games, and they came back with a Dreamcast, 4 controllers, and one of every launch title. And we freaking, I mean, I'm not gonna say that I wasn't responsible for most of my failings my freshman year, but certainly in the first like week or two of school, that was a major distraction for me, because we were just down there just playing friggin' Ready to Rumble boxing, Vigilante 8, NFL 2K. We didn't really. I didn't play too much Sonic because I mean it was single player. I was only just trying to play the multiplayer games with them. But man, it's such a cool system, and just everything about it. in my eyes was groundbreaking. It was the first one to come with bundled with a modem. You know, it was the first one where if you booted it up without a CD or without a game disc in it, it had Windows. You know,
Yeah. Yep. Yeah. It kind of had its own little. It's funny. You're right. It was pretty far ahead of its time for what it was. Um, because yeah, like you said, the any other system around prior or in that same era anyway for what was out, yeah, there was no operating system necessarily. Everything booted off the disk or the cartridge.
right,
That's just how it was. It really wasn't until later generations where that became like it's pretty normal now. Like boot up the Switch or Xbox or a PlayStation now. I mean, they all have their own OS. I mean, it's menu based system. Dreamcast kind of brought that to light.
right.
The one thing I will say, it's funny, and you mentioned it to me in text that you picked up a copy of Crazy Taxi with a recent Dreamcast purchase, and I remember playing that, and I remember playing and having one of the ECW games, and I can't remember. I think it's Anarchy Rules.
Yeah,
Um,
Anarchy Rules and Hardcore Revolution came out.
yeah, yeah, I had Anarchy Rules for it. I think that was the one. And House of the Dead 2,
Hmm.
I want to say, had that. But the one thing I thought this was kind of funny. This is more of one of those obscure things because this was a Dreamcast game, Power Stone.
Oh, I love Power Stone.
I have the soundtrack on CD
Do you?
somewhere. Yeah.
You know what?
Yeah.
That was that was one of the other games that they had. Um, and we played the crap out of that too, because that was a launch game.
Yeah. I had the soundtrack for that. It's one of those weird things that I got from working at Toucan Do.
Nice.
They had some of this, like the music stuff I held on to. And it bugs me because there was another in that same era soundtrack I had for a game that I'm pretty certain was on the Dreamcast. It just escapes my mind, and I'd have to either dig through my things, or it's very possible that I sold whatever it was. But for the most part, my music collection has been intact, so I might still have it. I just have to dig through it. Um, but yeah, no, those are the things that really stuck with me on game wise for that. Because, like I said, again, kind of like the Saturn for me, I didn't really appreciate it. I had it, and of course, it was a different time for me. I was like finishing up high school, started to get into different things. Um, you know, I was I was getting probably still playing more like PlayStation. I was still probably still playing a lot of Nintendo 64 at that point.
Yeah, yeah.
It was one of those things that like I've probably spent a lot more time, and it just Dreamcast was kind of like an afterthought, unfortunately, to
Yeah.
me at the time.
I didn't end up getting a Dreamcast of my own until I believe it was right around when they announced that it was dying. Um, and you and I used to one of the funny thing besides like Power Stone, because Power Stone and Power Stone 2 were two of the best fighting games that I've ever played in my life. I wish I had Power Stone. Power Stone 2 is one of those games that's now like ridiculously expensive. Um, but such a good game. And if I could find a good copy of that for relatively cheap, I might have to make that investment. Um, but one of the fun things that we used to do, you and I, was like you said, the homebrew and the emulation. So, for a while I didn't have an NES, an original NES. And what we used to do is I had an NES emulator that we would use on a boot disk, because that was really the downfall of the Dreamcast. Besides, the PlayStation and not using DVD technology, um, the piracy scene killed it,
Yeah.
because you could like literally a year or two after it came out, people were able to burn the entire library to disk, put it in, and never have to buy a Dreamcast game. Um, toy God, the games keep coming to me as I'm talking about this. Toy Commander was another good one. But you and I would play baseball stars. And
Yes.
I'm not going to get into too much detail as to, we used to have come up with some creative names. We'll leave it at that, um, for the players and teams. But we would have these epic freaking, like, we would do like basically tournaments essentially in baseball stars, and it was just super fun. Now, the other thing, the one thing that the Dreamcast opened my eyes to with regards to the emulation and all that stuff is, do you remember that disc of games I had?
Hmm. I think I still have my copy of it.
Really?
I think
Do you
uh,
remember how many ROM hacks were on there?
a lot.
Because
There were several hundred on ROMs on there, I believe,
oh
weren't
yeah,
there?
I think I had like 700. It was 700 something. I think it was almost close to 800. Um, Now there's some ones that I'm not going to get into because I didn't even realize what they were until I burned the disc and I start going through. I'm like, oh, that's a weird name. I'm going to click that, and it was terrible. It was awful. There was one that was one of the funniest ROM hacks I've ever seen in my life, and it was based on River City Rampage. And every time you would hit somebody, the per like so in the regular River City Rampage, if you hit somebody, they would make an exclamation. In that in that version, they would yell an expletive. Now, obviously, it's not yelling it because it was Nintendo, so it's not we weren't that advanced. But they would have
Right.
like the little word bubble pop up, and then like they changed the weapons. Like the one weapon was a baseball bat. It wasn't a bat anymore. Well, I mean, I guess it was kind of a bat, but it was more phallic, much more phallic.
Yes, I
Um,
remember that.
and then like when you would go in the shops, instead of like items or food or drinks or whatever, they would be offering you sexual services, and the girl was naked. So pixelated boobies. Uh, but it was funny, man. But that not only did the Dreamcast a great system on its own with the games it had. Like you said, the Power Stone games. I remember absolutely loving the Ready to Rumble boxing, and and it gave birth to the 2K series for football, so I can't complain there either. Uh,
Yeah.
but
Yeah.
the homebrew scene, which I knew nothing about until this system came about, it was a great system. I feel like it was ahead of its time, and if maybe if Sega had made a couple different moves, and maybe if they would have had a little bit more support from third party, Capcom was awesome for them. Capcom put out the definitive version of Marvel vs. Capcom and Marvel vs. Capcom 2 on their system. I mean, the Marvel vs. Capcom 2, the definitive one, came out later on the Xbox, but for the time, uh, the one that came out on the Dreamcast was the one because it came out on PlayStation 1, but you couldn't, but it wasn't the same. There
Right.
were they changed a lot of stuff between the Dreamcast version, which was like arcade perfect for Marvel vs. Capcom and Marvel vs. Capcom 2, versus the pared down versions for PlayStation of the same games. Um, and it was basically an arcade game, and that was the way they designed it. Was it ran on the Naomi architecture, which is what Sega was putting all of its arcade games on. So you were getting arcade perfect. The reason that Crazy Taxi was so good at home when compared to the arcade was because it was the same game.
Right. Right.
It was
Yeah.
all the Dreamcast was designed to run arcade games. So it was just an amazing before its time console.
Yeah, I agree. And I think we're uh, close to wrapping this up. There's a couple things I do want to say. Sega does live on. Um, you hooked us up with a copy of Sonic Forces and Super Monkey Ball for the Switch. Just both tremendous games. And I've had a lot of fun playing like Sonic Mania
Yes.
for the Switch. So yeah, it lives on. It's a shame that there's no more consoles, but it's still there, still a brand, still a developer. Um, but did you have anything you wanted to kind of close up on the Sega show with?
Just, the one thing that I'll say is, I'm a huge Nintendo fan. Obviously I have a Switch. I have every single Nintendo system still, for the home systems, but Sega's always going to own that place in my heart, that nostalgia place where, you know, it may not have been the biggest, it may not have been the best, but it was great. And maybe someday it'll come back.
Yeah, yeah, and maybe it'll come back. And I think maybe in a point where there's some kind of retro. Uh, I know they always have the, oh yeah, let's really, and then Sega has one too. They've had it where they have the ones that you buy at Bed Bath and Beyond. I say,
Yeah.
those types of things. But maybe there'll be something where they actually have like, hey, we could throw cartridges in it, and maybe it will have some, some baked in games, and it'll do some other things. Maybe a good nice retro release, not some of the stuff that's been out there.
Well, what I would like is, they did come out with the Sega Genesis Classic Mini or whatever it was called. That was very much like the NES Mini and SNES Mini that Nintendo released.
Yeah,
I'd love to see one that crossed all eras and had Game Gear games, Master System games, Genesis, like every single system. Because we're at the
yeah,
point we can do that. They
yeah.
could very easily do that. Let's do that, Sega. Let's release that around this Christmas. It'll be a nice Christmas present. Thank you very much. I appreciate it.
Hey,
But
yeah, maybe it's in the works.
hopefully,
They'll announce it tomorrow.
better if they. Yeah, listen. First of all, they better. Second of all, if they do, I want to cut, or at least one. Just give me one. I don't need money from it. I don't need it. Just send me one.
There you
Okay.
go. We'll promote it on the next one.
Heck yeah. All right. Well, until next
This has been
time.
fun.
Yeah, we have been the Noise Brigade. Thank you for listening, and we will see you next time.
Later on, everyone.